Fred, and you're watching Best Metal Recording Tips. In a moment, we'll discuss how you can create quality recordings without a band. Getting a huge guitar tone, making your recordings loud AF, compression, EQ, and even adding orchestral elements. So grab your axe and let's get to it. Now, before we begin, I'll be the first to admit I'm far from a pro when it comes to recording. For me, it's just a means to an end. The most important thing is the musical content. Because even if you have the best gear in the world, no one cares unless you can make them feel something. Artists are completely delusional these days when it comes to understanding how people consume music. You put all this effort into making what you think is a mind-blowing recording, just so people can listen to your epic song on their smartphone with the volume down while taking a shit. And no one's gonna put on headphones to listen to your track. Now, before we begin, I'll leave a link to my Patreon page below. There I'll upload the Logic file itself so you can see exactly what's going on. Patreon is where I keep all my tabs, compositional ideas, and other goodies as well. You're gonna love it. Best metal recording tips, let's get straight to it. Now we're here in my DAW of choice Logic Pro. But do I really have a choice, Apple? Now here's just an overview of the file. There's a lot going on. I've got like 15 tracks, only 3 guitar tracks, but there's quite a lot of other stuff adding to that guitar sound. Think of the Yngwie J. Malmsteen adage, more is more.
I always said, how can that be? How could less be more? It's impossible. More is more.
And one other thing I'm going to mention, if you want to go to depth on this, I'm going to upload the Logic file to my Patreon page. So you can download that and get inside my brain. We're going to start with the basic tracks. Basic tracks are drums and bass. You start with those and then build on top. Now for the bass guitar, I'm using Contact's plugin here, Eurobass. Pretty cool sound. You can turn on distortion. I don't have distortion on with this one though, and actually what I'm doing is I'm adding a second bass guitar track and I'm putting distortion on this one. So you hear that monster fuzz. Turn off the monster fuzz. Gives it a little extra roar. Now you can see with the panning here, I'm panning him a little bit to the left and right to get a wider sound. And I work in the score editor within Logic so I can see the notes. And what I've got is just some pedal tones basically. Low B pedal tones. Now something that's really important to mention here is compression. So I'm using a compressor here within Logic. I usually keep the compression pretty light. It's not even up to -5 dBs. I have the threshold set to -26 here. And the reason compression is so important is it controls the sound, reduces those highs and lows, but it also makes your recordings loud. And as metal guitar players, that's extremely important. Can I get an amen, Death Magnetic?
Could you just do me a yeah?
All right, moving on to the drums. Now, normally in the studio, you'd have, a big setup to do, a bunch of different microphones going to each one of the drum kit parts. It's a total fiasco. But we're going to keep things real simple here with Easy Drummer 2 as a plugin. I'm just on the basic setting. So for the drums, I've got a little EQ on here, taking out those low ends and also adding a little bit of high end, which helps those cymbals shimmer. Of course, again, we've got compression, but not too much compression. And I input all the notes again using the score editor, but you can do whatever the fuck you want to do. A lot of people prefer to use the piano roll. So if you double click on the sequence object, that gives you the piano roll. All right, let's move on to guitars. Now for the guitar sound, I'm using the Line 6 Helix. And the first thing you got to do is put on that gate. Turn the threshold up. You don't want any of that noise, crackle, and hiss coming through. If you guys are interested in the exact settings, you can pause the video and check these out. There's my distortion pedal, amp settings, a little bit of EQ, and the cabinet. So I've got 3 guitar tracks. There's one going down the middle, and then 2 others panned hard left and hard right. Now here again, I've got the compression happening. You obviously don't need much compression on distorted guitars because distortion naturally compresses things. Now we've also got some EQ. And I like to accentuate the low mids a little bit and then neutralize those low frequencies because you don't hear them on guitar anyways and they just clutter the recording. Adding in some highs as well. And then we've got the guitars that are panned both hard left and right. Put them all together. Is a very saturated sound. And one thing you want to keep in mind when you're recording guitars, a good tone on its own may not be a good tone in the mix. So don't get too attached to the way your guitar sounds when you're just playing by yourself. It's all about how it sits in the context of the song with all the other instruments. Also, each of these tracks were recorded separately. This is not copying and pasting. These are 3 separate performances. That's extremely important to get a deep, rich guitar sound. Now that we've covered the basics, let's get to some of the additional elements I'm using. There'll be exactly 666 tips here. Also the year I was born. Now something I like to do is to add different tone qualities to the bass line. So I'm using the piano here to add another dimension to the bass part. Gives it more attack and also a different tone color. I'm also adding a synth bass sound in here. And these are very low notes. If you look at the score here, this is the bass clef, and I'm just like way down south.
You sexy motherfucker.
You don't want that stuff too high in the mix, but it just adds a lot of gravitas. So this is actually a really cool concept. Don't just think of your guitar as being the only source of tone. You know, you can take something like the Alchemy synth within Logic here and use these tones, you know, to add to your guitar sound. I have to say this Alchemy synth is absolutely amazing. There's so much good stuff in there. Another way that I'm manipulating the guitar sound is I'm using orchestral samples. So I'm using Vienna Symphonic Library plugins here. Here's their interface. And this is a short percussive sound. So I'm just using that to add these stabs and hits. There's something really magical that happens when you take a brass section in an orchestra and play it fortissimo or really loud. It creates this really natural, rich, harmonic distortion. And you can use that, like I said, to layer your actual guitar sound. Now I've got a pedal tone happening here in the orchestra as well. It's just one note. And then we got a few textural elements happening here. I've got a melody. So that's made up of 2 different sounds. So I've got sine bells and also a dulcimer. So that's something to keep in mind is you can take, you know, 2 or more different sounds and combine them into one hybrid tone that doesn't sound like anything you've ever heard. So I've got a choir layering below the sine bells and dulcimer as well. And you can see the panning here, I've got everything panned in a different place. You know, that's going to make a wider stereo image. You don't want to just put everything right down the middle. It's going to be smashed all on top of each other, and you're not going to have any width and depth in your recording. Now, I'm not really going to cover the mixing in this video. Mixing obviously comes down to adjusting volume levels on individual tracks, and it's also a lot about EQ and letting each instrument sort of have space to breathe. But that's a whole nother video. So let's talk about mastering, which is basically adding tone color and making your recording super loud. Can I get an amen, Death Magnetic? So I use a couple of different tools for mastering. This is probably one of the most important ones, the multipressor. So there it is with the multipressor on. With the multipressor off, now you may not be able to hear that too well through the speakers, but it adds a tremendous amount. So the basic idea behind the multipressor is you compress different frequency bands. So you got the low frequencies here, low mids, and highs. It not only adds volume, but also, like I said, it shapes your tone. Now I've got a little bit of stereo spread happening here. This is a much more subtle difference, but again, it just makes everything wider. Now after that, we've got the adaptive limiter. This is extremely important. What you want to do with the adaptive limiter is set your output ceiling to negative 0.1. And what that's going to do is cut off any levels right before they distort. It gets you right up to that point of maximum loudness and then stops. Now I use the multimeter here to check and see how well I've done my mastering. So it's going to show you your levels basically, and you want to be getting up here, you know, -9, -6. And you also want to be seeing those levels kind of stay at the same point and not doing this. That means you have it compressed very well. So jump in and get your hands dirty. Start experimenting with recording and eject some ideas into the universe. A really important concept here is quantity over quality. Stop waiting for the stars to align to record your ideas. The key is just start cranking shit out, and over time, that quantity turns into quality. You know, the funny thing is music is free now. You're not going to make much trying to sell your recordings like the old days. What the fans are looking for now is a closer connection to the artist. Take your viewers along for the ride and show them the process you go through when you create. Try not to get bogged down with what people think and just make music. Until next time, shred till you're dead. Death Magnetic.